The flashing blue and red lights washed across my windshield like pulsing thunderclouds, filling the cold night air with the sharp crackle of police radios. I sat alone in the driver's seat of a black SUV parked across the street, watching as two federal agents marched my brother out of his apartment building in handcuffs. The metal cuffs glinted under the street lamp, a bright, cruel flash I can still see when I close my eyes. Marcus kept shaking his head, mumbling that it had to be a mistake, his breath a pale fog in the December air. One of the agents steadied him with a firm hand on his elbow, guiding him down the steps as neighbors peeked through blinds and cracked open doors. I could smell exhaust from the idling FBI vehicle, mixed with the faint, bitter scent of someone's cigarette drifting down the block. My fingers were numb against the steering wheel, not because of the cold, but because this was the moment I realized my family would never see me the same way again. And Marcus? He had no idea this was only the beginning. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Sophie Hale. I'm 33 years old, and for most of my adult life, my family treated me like the one who lived just shy of her potential. The one who played it safe. The one who would always need a little help to get by. On the surface, I guess I made it easy for them to believe that. I lived in a modest apartment on the north side of Seattle, nothing fancy, a place where the walls stayed cool no matter how high I turned the heat, and the hallway always smelled faintly like someone was cooking onions. I drove an aging Honda that rattled a bit when it idled at red lights. I wore simple clothes to family dinners, clean-pressed, never flashy. To them, I was just steady, dependable. Sophie, the sibling who had a quiet job in some nondescript financial office and wasn't ambitious enough to shoot for anything bigger. Meanwhile, my brother Marcus lived loudly. He had this way of filling a room with his energy, even when that energy wasn't exactly positive. At family gatherings, he'd clap people on the back, laugh too loudly, talk about the next big thing he was investing in, or the promotion he swore was coming any day. You could always smell his cologne before he entered a room, that sharp, woodsy scent he bought in bulk from the discount store. Mom doted on him like he hung the moon, asking how work was going, if he needed anything, if he had enough tucked away for emergencies. Dad would give these subtle nods of approval whenever Marcus talked about his plans, even though half of those plans never came to life. Jennifer, my older sister, was the achiever, always had been. Perfect report cards, perfect career path, perfect family, Christmas card every year. And when she talked, the room leaned in. Even her perfume, warm vanilla, seemed to draw people closer. Me, I was the one people forgot to ask follow-up questions about. I'd sit at the dinner table under the soft, yellow glow of Mom's chandelier, listening as everyone talked over each other, sipping my iced tea, and waiting for anyone to ask how my week had been. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. It wasn't spiteful. Just habit, a pattern, a long, slow erasure. The truth is, I didn't correct them, not once. I let them believe I was quietly treading water, working a modest job, living a modest life. Maybe part of me wanted to see who they were when they thought I had nothing to offer. Maybe another part of me knew that if I revealed the truth, the scale of it, the power of it, they'd stop seeing me and start seeing the money. Still, even knowing all that, there were moments that stung more than they should have. I remember one Sunday last spring, standing in my parents' kitchen, the warm smell of Mom's pot roast filling the air. Marcus had come over early, pacing the tile floor, the soles of his shoes squeaking every few steps. He was ranting about how expensive everything was, gas, rent, groceries, waving his hands like the whole world was conspiring against him. Then he turned to me. "Sophie, you don't get it. You're used to scraping by. You're built for it." He said it casually, almost playfully. But the words landed like a slap, sharp and cold. Mom didn't correct him. Dad didn't either. Jennifer raised an eyebrow, but didn't say a word. And I just stood there, stirring the lemonade I'd brought, pretending I didn't feel the weight of being dismissed in my own childhood home. That was the moment, the first fracture, when I realized we weren't just drifting apart. They were looking at me through a lens that had never belonged to me in the first place. A lens I no longer recognized. I told myself it didn't matter. That I had my own life, my own world, and none of them needed to know what was behind the curtain. But deep down in that small, quiet place, inside your chest, where the truth hides, I knew that one day, the divide between who they thought I was and who I actually became would break open. And when it did, it wouldn't be gentle. The day my brother texted me about selling my old Honda for $5,000, that was the crack that split everything wide open. And it was only the beginning of a storm none of us were prepared for. The rain had been falling hard that afternoon, turning the backyard into patches of slick mud, but I still remember the way the cold air stung my cheeks. I was 10, standing behind the sliding glass door that fogged slightly every time I exhaled. Outside, my siblings were racing across the lawn, their shoes splashing through puddles as Dad filmed them with the old camcorder perched on his shoulder. Jennifer's laughter rang bright as a bell, sharp and clear, while Marcus shouted for her to slow down. The smell of wet grass drifted inside each time the door opened, cool and earthy, settling around me like a reminder of where I wasn't allowed to go. Mom's hand rested lightly on the top of my head as she nudged the curtain aside just enough for me to see. "You stay here, sweetheart." She'd whispered, her voice gentle but firm, the way someone might speak to a fragile object. "You'll only slow them down. Let them have their fun." Her breath had carried the faint scent of peppermint tea. I watched the three of them disappear toward the shed, the golden hour light stretching their shadows long across the grass. I tapped lightly on the glass, a soft, hollow sound, hoping someone would look back. No one did. The last image I saw before the curtain fell over the door was Jennifer waving both arms, dramatically calling for Dad to start recording again. The camera followed her like she was the only one in the world. That sound, the sliding door clicking shut behind me, stayed inside my chest for years. For a long time, I thought that moment was just childhood. But it wasn't. It was the first of many echoes. Even now, when I think about my family and how we ended up the way we did, my mind drifts back to that rainy afternoon, the smell of wet earth, the cold pane of glass under my palms, and the sense that I'd been placed on the outside long before I understood what it meant. As life moved on from those early years, the patterns followed in quieter ways, woven into birthdays, holidays, and school events like faint threads most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking closely. Growing up in our house meant living in a hierarchy no one ever acknowledged out loud. Jennifer was the star, polished, clever, always prepared to charm a room. Marcus was the adored son, loud, impulsive, but forgiven before he even asked. Me, I was the calm one, the steady child, the one who didn't need anything, or so everyone assumed. Whenever we celebrated someone's birthday, the house would fill with warm smells, roast chicken vanilla frosting, the sugary scent of lemonade. Jennifer's gifts were wrapped with ribbons. Marcus's with shiny paper that crinkled loudly when he tore it open. When my turn came, there was always a moment where the air shifted. Not badly, just differently. "Don't make a fuss," Mom would murmur as she handed me a small package with her soft, floral perfume lingering in the air. Dad would nod approvingly. "Your sister and brother need the encouragement more," he'd say, as if ambition were something handed out like pie slices. I used to tell myself they meant well. They probably did. But good intentions don't soften the memory of feeling like you're always expected to settle for less. By high school, the dynamic had become so familiar that I barely noticed it anymore. Jennifer would glide down the staircase on winter formal night, her dress shimmering under the warm foyer lights, while Mom adjusted her necklace and Dad snapped photos like she was walking a red carpet. Marcus would swagger behind her, smelling faintly of cheap cologne, tossing Dad a grin that earned a chuckle and a pat on the back. When I came down in a simple dress I'd saved up for the hallway, felt colder. Mom gave me a tight smile, not unkind, just distracted, and Dad looked at his watch. "You look nice, Soph," he'd say before ushering Marcus toward the car so they wouldn't be late. The air smelled faintly like the pine cleaner Mom used on the banister. It mixed with the lavender spray I'd put in my hair, a scent that seemed suddenly too small, too quiet compared to everything happening around me. Year after year, these moments built themselves into something heavier than I knew how to name. A kind of quiet acceptance settled over me like a coat I'd never chosen but kept wearing because no one offered me another. I became good at taking up less space, good at not asking for more than what I was handed, good at swallowing disappointment before anyone noticed. When I moved out at 26, I rented a modest apartment with thin walls and a heater that clanked like old pipes settling into winter. I furnished it with mismatched chairs and a thrifted coffee table that still smelled faintly of wood polish. And even then, especially then, my parents' reactions told me everything about how they saw my future. Mom visited once, walking through the rooms with her cardigan draped over her shoulders, touching the counter with her fingertips. "It's cozy," she'd said, her tone soft, but carrying that note of gentle pity. Dad stood by the window, watching cars move along the street below. "This is a good start," he'd murmured. "You'll get where you need to go eventually." His voice was distant, almost patronizing, though I don't think he meant it that way. I nodded, pretending the cool draft slipping through the window frame didn't bother me, pretending their words didn't either. By then, I had already begun building the foundation of the company no one knew existed. I'd begun making decisions that could shift millions while still being treated like the child who didn't need much, didn't expect much, and didn't belong in spaces where ambition lived. Maybe that's why I kept the secret so carefully, why I never corrected them when they imagined me trudging through a modest life, a modest job, a modest future. Every time I thought about telling them, something inside me hesitated, a voice that had grown louder with every quiet dismissal. If they found out, would they see me differently, or would they finally see me at all? But I also knew another truth. The roots of being overlooked run deep, growing through years of small moments, subtle comments, gentle erasures. And those roots know how to pull a person back into silence. Still, there were moments that made something shift, even if just slightly. Tiny pricks that pierced through the quiet I'd trained myself to accept. One Thanksgiving, for example, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasting turkey, the air warm from the oven and crowded with chatter. I'd brought a pie I'd baked the night before, maple pecan, still slightly warm, the foil catching the golden kitchen light. Jennifer looked at it briefly before turning back to her conversation. Marcus brushed past me to get to the mashed potatoes. Mom slid my pie to the far end of the counter behind the store-bought pumpkin one she preferred. I remember standing there, feeling the heat from the stove on my hands, hearing the hum of the dishwasher, and realizing how accustomed I'd become to being the extra, the afterthought, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one expected to understand her place without needing to be told. Those memories collected quietly like dust on a bookshelf. Not dramatic, not loud, just present, always present. So when Marcus borrowed my old Honda, or what he thought was my old Honda, it wasn't just another careless moment. It was the culmination of a lifetime of assumptions. A lifetime of believing I wouldn't mind, believing my things didn't matter, believing I didn't matter in the same way. I didn't yet know it, but something was already shifting beneath the surface. The first crack had already formed, and what was coming next, the truth, the fallout, The unraveling would expose every hidden root of the past I'd spent years trying to outgrow. The message flashed across my phone screen so suddenly that for a moment I thought I'd misread it. The office around me hummed with quiet, the steady thrum of the HVAC, the faint scratching of my assistant's pen outside the glass wall, the soft click of rain tapping against the windows 42 floors above the city. But all of that faded as I stared at the words glowing back at me. Sold your Honda for $5,000. Needed the cash. Hope you don't mind? My finger hovered above the screen, cold and rigid, as if touching it would make the message more real. The fluorescent light above my desk flickered softly, catching the reflective sheen of the quarterly reports spread around me. I could almost feel my pulse in the tips of my fingers. Something in the air shifted, a quiet, unnatural stillness, the kind that falls right before a storm breaks. I pulled up the digital records with a single keystroke, the screen washing my hands in a pale, icy glow. And there it was, the VIN number, the registration, the unmistakable description of the vehicle Marcus had taken. Not the Honda. Not even close. The McLaren's photo stared back at me, the metallic silver casting long shadows across my desk, like it knew something I didn't want to admit. I leaned forward, breath shallow, as if the truth were a physical presence in the room, waiting for me to meet its eyes. For a long moment, I sat there, listening to the muted hum of the building, feeling the weight of what I'd just uncovered pressing down on my shoulders. It was the kind of shock that rearranges the air around you, leaving everything exactly where it was, yet undeniably changed. Once the initial wave passed, the pieces began clicking into place with a clarity that made my chest tighten. That single text, a thoughtless message sent in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, cracked open something much deeper. It wasn't just about the car. It wasn't even about the money. It was about the truth I had been trying not to see for years. As I traced the edges of that realization, I couldn't ignore how neatly the past fit into the present. The assumption that my belongings had little value, the casual way my needs were pushed aside, the belief that what belonged to me could be taken, borrowed, rearranged, or dismissed without consequence. It wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern, old, familiar, and quietly woven into the fabric of our family. The more records I opened, the colder the air felt around me. The McLaren's acquisition form, the insurance documents, the digital signatures, all there, organized, precise, undisputable. Paper trails don't lie, and this one spelled out exactly how serious the situation was. The vehicle wasn't just mine. It belonged to the company I had built with years of sleepless nights, careful decisions, and the kind of solitary persistence no one in my family had ever bothered to ask about. I replayed Marcus's message again, reading each word as if it might somehow change the 5th or 6th time around. Thanks for understanding. There was a breezy familiarity in his tone, the kind reserved for small favors, driving someone to the airport, borrowing a jacket, asking for a ride. Something in that casual gratitude made my skin prickle. It wasn't malicious. That was what made it worse. He wasn't afraid of disappointing me, because somewhere along the line, he'd learned I didn't require respect to begin with. While the legal implications began taking shape in my mind, something else unfolded, too slower, quieter, like a camera panning from one detail to the next. I realized how often I had downplayed my own boundaries, how often I'd allowed my family to believe I didn't have much to lose. That modest apartment, the worn-out Honda, the understated clothes, I thought I was buying myself privacy. But somewhere in that quiet, I had also bought invisibility. I could hear the soft whir of the elevator outside my office, the faint murmur of people heading home for the evening. The world went about its business unaware that mine had just shifted. I leaned back, letting the leather of my chair groan softly beneath my weight. The city spread out beneath me in a mosaic of streetlights and gray sky. And with that stillness came a thin, cutting line of resolution. Not anger yet, not fear either. Just clarity, the kind that arrives when the truth finally catches up to you no matter how long you tried to outrun it. Because this wasn't just Marcus's mistake. It wasn't even his first one. For years, he'd been tumbling from one financial crisis to another. Debts he couldn't manage, risks he couldn't afford, favors he expected everyone else to cover. The difference this time was the scale, the consequences, and the sheer recklessness of what he'd touched without understanding. But beneath all of that, a deeper truth stirred. Something I hadn't wanted to name. Marcus hadn't believed the car was worth much, because he didn't believe I had much worth attached to anything I owned. He thought he knew my world, and that world, the one I let him see, wasn't one he'd ever shown respect for. With every document I opened, I could feel an old ache, waking up the ache of being underestimated, overlooked, handled like someone who would always forgive, always adapt, never fight back. That ache sharpened into something else as I scrolled through the files, a slow rising heat in the center of my chest, a kind of anger I had never allowed myself to feel fully. I called legal. My voice sounded steadier than I expected, though I could feel the tremor beneath it like a held breath. The moment I handed the situation over to them, I knew something had shifted permanently. There was no putting the lid back on this, no minimizing it, no quiet conversation that would make it disappear. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was still deliberate, almost clinical. But beneath that calm lay a resolve shaped by years of being dismissed. Years of being the one they didn't worry about. Years of hiding so well that even my own brother believed nothing I owned had real value. While the legal team moved into action with startling speed, I allowed myself one more moment of stillness. The office lights dimmed automatically as evening settled outside. The city glow flickered across the glass walls, casting long shadows across my desk. And in that hushed, glowing quiet, I made the decision that would change everything. I was done being invisible. I was done letting everyone assume I had nothing worth protecting. And as I gathered the documents and prepared for the conversations ahead, conversations that would unravel every secret I'd kept, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my bones. Not fear, not regret, resolve. Because once the truth comes out, there's no going back. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in going back at all. What was coming next would force every buried assumption into the light, and none of us would come out unchanged. The dining room had fallen into a brittle, crystalline silence just as I rose from my chair. The overhead light cast a sharp glow across the polished table, catching the edge of the manila folder in my hands like a blade. My family's faces were turned toward me, Marcus frozen mid-breath, Jennifer gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, my parents leaning in with matching looks of dread. The air was thick with the smell of roasted chicken and something slightly burnt from the kitchen, though no one had touched a bite in several minutes. I placed the folder on the table and flipped it open, the papers whispering loudly in the quiet room. A printed screenshot Marcus's text message slid forward. The scrape of the paper against the wood sounded like a warning. "You're going to want to read this," I said, my voice steady low. Marcus's fork clattered to his plate, Evelyn inhaled sharply, fingertips brushing the edge of her napkin. And then I said the words that cracked the night in half. That wasn't my Honda you sold. It was a company-owned vehicle worth $340,000. The room erupted in gasps, soft, sharp, overlapping like a chorus of disbelief. And that's where it all began to unravel. But let me pull you into how we reached that moment, how the truth, every thread of it, found its way into the open. The days leading up to that dinner felt like walking with a storm pressed against my back. Every room I entered carried the faint hum of tension, like the air before lightning touches ground. I kept the documents close, the registration forms, the insurance files, the email confirmations, even the time-stamped call logs. When I'd printed the evidence that morning, the office smelled faintly of toner and fresh paper, the machine clicking in its rhythmic way. My hands shook once, just once, as I gathered the pages. I pressed them flat, breathing in the warm scent rising off the stack, and realized I wasn't shaking from fear. I was shaking from the weight of everything I had swallowed for years. I chose Sunday dinner because that was the only night everyone came home. The night we were all supposed to be equals around the table. The night pretense was hardest to maintain. And I didn't come alone. I carried answers. I carried receipts. I carried truth that could not be softened. When I walked into my parents' house that evening, the familiar scent of rosemary and lemon drifted from the oven, mingling with the faint citrus cleaner Mom always used on the kitchen counters. I could hear Marcus laughing with Dad in the living room, loud, booming laughter that rattled something deep in me. Not anger, not jealousy, just the old ache of a child pressing her palms against the sliding glass door. I waited until plates were filled, until hands were settled on silverware, until conversation hovered in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Then I stood, and everything stopped. The room after the reveal felt colder, as though someone had opened a window. Marcus's mouth opened and closed soundless, like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Mom pressed her napkin to her lips, eyes wide. Dad leaned back slowly, the chair's wooden frame groaning under the shift. The scent of roasted garlic suddenly felt too strong, almost sour. How is that possible? Mom asked, barely above a whisper. I held their eyes one by one. It's possible, I said, because I'm not who you thought I was. Marcus swallowed, his voice cracking. Sophie, I swear I didn't know. I really thought it was just the Honda. I didn't. You didn't ask, I said quietly. You never asked. His eyes flicked down to the papers, the text message printed in stark black ink, accusing him from the tabletop. But the night wasn't done with us yet, because the truth I carried wasn't limited to the car. While the room was still spinning from the first blow, I slid another sheet forward, this one heavier in meaning than anything they'd seen so far. It was a bank statement, and not mine. Dad leaned forward, brow furrowing as he scanned the page, his face drained of color. Mom clutched her necklace fingers, trembling. Jennifer's eyes darted from the statement to Marcus, confusion twisting into something sharper. What is this? Jennifer asked, her voice thin. It's a transfer record, I said, from my personal account, 6 months ago. I paused just long enough for the air to tighten. A transfer Marcus made using my name. Marcus froze. Completely. What? No, I didn't. But the next page said otherwise. A digital authorization form. My name typed neatly. Not in my handwriting, not using any of my devices. Dad's voice cracked first. Marcus, tell me you didn't do this. I didn't. Marcus's voice rose raw, panicked. I swear I didn't touch her accounts. But then the realization hit me slow and icy. He was telling the truth. And someone else in the room went very, very still. The kind of stillness that carries guilt. Jennifer. Her face had drained of all color. Her hand hovered over her wine glass without touching it. Her breath was shallow. "Jen," I asked softly. She blinked slowly like someone waking from a dream. I thought." The room leaned closer without moving. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. "I thought you wouldn't notice," she whispered. Dad slammed his hand on the table so hard the plates rattled. "Jennifer Ann Hale, what did you do?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling onto her cheeks as she looked at me. "You never needed the money," she choked out. "You never needed anything. You always seemed fine. You always had everything under control." Her voice trembled. "Marcus needed help. Dad wouldn't give him more. Mom said we should let him learn the hard way, so I found a way." A heat rose up my spine. Not anger, not yet, but a deep, hollow ache. "You forged my signature," I said. My voice was soft, too soft. "And you stole from me." Jennifer nodded, sobbing quietly, the soft sound like falling fabric. "I didn't think you'd care. I didn't think you'd notice. I thought you were just coasting." Her eyes met mine with a sudden, startling honesty. "I didn't know you were successful. I didn't know you were—" She stopped, breath catching. "I didn't know who you were." The room froze. Dad's fork scraped uselessly against his plate. Mom's breath hitched. Marcus pressed his hands over his face, shoulders shaking. And the weight of it all, years of assumptions, years of invisibility, finally settled into its true shape. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The silence in the room was louder than anything I could have said. "Marcus," I said gently, "you sold that car because you believed the only thing I owned was worthless." He shook his head violently. "No." "Soph, you did." My voice was steady. "Because that's how you've always seen me." I turned to Jennifer. "And you took money from me because you assumed I wouldn't notice, because you assumed I didn't have enough to miss." Her tears fell onto the tablecloth, darkening the fabric. "And Mom, Dad," I added, turning to them, "you never asked where I worked. You never asked what I wanted. You never asked who I was becoming." No one argued. Not this time. The truth had shifted the room the way a tidal wave shifts a shoreline. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with something heavier. A silence so thick it pressed against the walls. I gathered the folders, slipping each page back into place. The paper was cool beneath my fingertips. The room watched me with wide, wounded eyes. As I pushed back my chair, its legs scraped softly against the hardwood, a sound that echoed longer than it should have. "I'm not hiding anymore," I said, my voice calm. "Not my success, not my boundaries, not the truth." And with that, I stepped away from the table. Behind me, no one spoke. The quiet was absolute. A silence shaped not by anger, but by the undeniable weight of truth. And as I walked toward the doorway, the air shifting against my skin, I knew the next chapter would not look like any of the ones before. The doorway felt strangely cool as I stepped through it, the soft click of my heels echoing down the hallway like a final punctuation mark. Behind me, the dining room remained suspended in stunned silence, the scent of roasted chicken and candle wax still clinging to my clothes. I paused for a moment by the entry table, resting one hand on its smooth wooden surface, as I took a long, steady breath. The air tasted different, lighter somehow, as if the house itself had exhaled with me. Outside, the night was colder than I expected, the crisp air brushing across my face like a quiet blessing. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest loosened just enough for my heart to move freely again. Something had shifted, not only in them, but in me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said, and the space I stepped into felt like the true beginning of something I had denied myself far too long. The drive home that night was silent, except for the low hum of the engine and the soft rattle of the heater warming the cabin. As the city lights flickered past my windows, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost tactile. Healing wasn't going to come from waiting for anyone to change. It was going to come from choosing myself deliberately, consistently, and without apology. In the weeks that followed, reclaiming what was mine took on many forms, some small, some profound. It began with something as simple as unlocking the door to my penthouse for the first time, with no intention of hiding anymore. The air inside was cool and faintly scented with the fresh paint I had chosen myself, a warm, quiet ivory that softened the late afternoon light. I opened all the blinds, letting the sun pour in, illuminating the hardwood floors and casting gold across the edges of my furniture. Dust motes floated in the beams like tiny lanterns. I spent that first evening walking through every room, touching the walls, running my fingers along the smooth granite countertops, opening drawers I'd barely used before. Each motion felt like laying claim to spaces I had once walked through cautiously, as though I needed permission to inhabit them fully. I lit a candle in the living room, sandalwood rich and grounding. Its warm scent crept through the space, settling into the corners like a quiet promise that this life, this home, belonged to me. There were practical steps too, conversations with the legal team, documentation, to secure what had almost been taken, measures to ensure that trust would no longer rest on blind faith. But even these tasks held a kind of healing. Each form I signed, each account I restructured, each record I reclaimed was a reminder that I had built this life with intention and effort. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't someone to be dismissed. I was someone who had created something worth protecting. As for my family, I didn't cut anyone out with anger or cruelty. I simply stopped offering parts of myself that had never been valued. I answered calls when I had the emotional capacity. I visited when the timing felt right. The distance between us wasn't a wall. It was a boundary, one I set gently but firmly, like placing a fragile bowl back onto a shelf, where it could no longer be knocked over. Marcus called often, at first, his voice quieter, stripped of the bravado he once carried. There were apologies, real ones, threaded with the rawness of a man facing the consequences of his own unraveling. He asked questions he'd never asked before about my work, my company, my world. Sometimes his voice trembled with shame, sometimes with humility. I heard both, and I let him speak. Jennifer stayed silent for a long while. Her shame was heavier, more complicated. It arrived in the form of a handwritten letter slipped under my door one evening. The paper slightly wrinkled, her looping handwriting uneven. She wrote about envy she never understood, mistakes she could never take back, and the fear that she had ruined something that had once been unbreakable. I sat on my couch reading her words as the city lights flickered beyond the glass, the soft buzz of traffic rising faintly from the street below. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Forgiveness would come, but time would shape it first. During those months, I also discovered something unexpected, a kind of family growing quietly around me, in the spaces I'd been too busy or too guarded to notice before. My assistant Clara brought me coffee one cold morning and lingered a little longer than usual, her gentle voice offering support without prying. David from legal checked in frequently, not with professional updates, but with simple questions like, "How are you holding up today?" The warmth in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes during our meetings reminded me how rare it is to be seen without conditions. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before nodded warmly when we crossed paths in the lobby. One of them, an older woman named Mrs. Parker, with soft white curls and a cardigan that always smelled faintly of lavender, pressed a small tin of homemade cookies into my hands one evening. "For company," she said with a wink, as though she already knew how much I needed a small gesture of kindness. Healing came in waves, some subtle, some startling. I found myself rearranging the living room furniture one Sunday morning, while the sun streamed in warm and buttery through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pulled the couch away from the wall and angled it toward the light. I rolled out a new rug with a soft, thick weave that warmed my bare feet. Each shift felt like moving pieces of an inner puzzle, clearing out the residue of years spent hiding behind modesty that no longer belonged to me. One afternoon, I brought home a large potted plant, a fiddle-leaf fig, and placed it near the window where the light fell strongest. The leaves caught the afternoon glow, turning a rich, deep green. Something about watching it settle into its new place felt symbolic, like watching myself root into a life I had been afraid to fully claim. Work changed too. Not the responsibilities, those remained as demanding as ever, but my relationship with it. I stopped treating my success as something I needed to justify or hide. I allowed myself to take up space in meetings, to speak with the authority I had earned. I invested in new initiatives that excited me. Projects focused on education and financial empowerment for young women, something I wished I had known more of when I was quietly climbing my way upward. As the months passed, the ache of the past didn't disappear entirely, but it softened like a scar that no longer hurts when touched, but still reminds you of how far you've come. And one crisp autumn evening, as I stood by my window, watching the sun sink behind the skyline, I realized something profound. The journey hadn't been about exposing my family or proving my worth to them. It had been about finally seeing myself clearly, without the fog of their assumptions shaping my reflection. I understood then that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within the battles of identity, self-worth, and the quiet courage it takes to rewrite the story others wrote for us long before we learned to hold the pen. And in the warm glow of that fading sunset, with my home humming softly around me, I knew the truth with a certainty deep enough to settle my heart. We don't rise because others finally see our value. We rise because we finally stop dimming our own.